It was 7 a.m. I stood in my kitchen, coffee steaming in my hand, when I heard the click, my front door unlocking. No knock, no doorbell. I turn. Dolores Fitch, HOA president. Crisp blazer, perfect silver hair, gleaming pearl necklace. Clipboard ready. She's already in my living room, scanning like it's her property. She spots me, flashes that fake sweet smile. I'm just checking on a few things. That was the first time. Then the next, and the next. For 14 straight months, she used a key she had no business having, letting herself in whenever she wanted. No warning, no permission, pure entitlement. Until one morning. I looked down at both her hands under the kitchen light, and I smiled, because this time, she'd touched something she could never wash off, something permanent, something that would mark her, in ways she never saw coming. What would you do if your HOA president had a key to your house and treated it like her own? Drop it in the comments. Let me back up, because to understand how satisfying this ending was, you need to understand where I started. My name is Garrett Winslow. I'm a retired HVAC technician, 31 years bending copper pipe, crawling under mobile homes in August heat, and diagnosing problems that other guys gave up on. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a tech genius. I'm a guy who spent 3 decades learning that every system, whether it's a duct network or a neighborhood association, has pressure points if you know where to look. When I retired, my wife Lenora and I moved to Pinecroft Hollow, a quiet subdivision outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. The houses sat on half-acre lots with mature oaks that dropped acorns like little wooden hailstorms every October. The air smelled like pine resin and cut grass. The neighbors waved from their driveways. It felt, genuinely, like we'd earned something after 3 decades of hard work. We bought our house in the spring, closed on a Thursday. By that Saturday morning, Dolores Fitch was on our porch. She was 63 years old, trim, silver-haired, and dressed like she was about to chair a corporate board meeting. Pressed slacks, a blazer, pearl earrings. She smiled the way people smile when they want you to feel like they're doing you a favor. She introduced herself as HOA president, handed me a laminated welcome packet that was somehow already 12 pages long, and told me, not asked, told me, that she'd be doing a new resident inspection of the property the following Tuesday. Standard procedure, she said. I found out later it was not standard procedure. She'd invented it. The HOA for Pinecroft Hollow was governed by a set of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and Rs, filed with Knox County in 1987. I didn't read them that first weekend. Mistake. Because buried in those documents was a clause Dolores had quietly amended during a 2019 board meeting that 3 people attended. A provision granting the HOA president reasonable access to properties for inspection purposes, with 24-hour written notice. She used it like a skeleton key. The Tuesday inspection happened. I was polite. She walked through our living room, our garage, the backyard, making notes on a clipboard and muttering things like, "That fence line is going to be a problem," and "These gutters don't meet the updated code." The gutters were 6 months old. Here's the texture of those first weeks that I want you to feel. The crunch of her low heels on our gravel walkway. The faint, sharp smell of her hairspray drifting through rooms after she'd left. The particular silence of a house that doesn't feel entirely yours anymore. Lenora started double-locking the door, but Dolores had somehow obtained a copy of our key during the home sale process. We found out later the previous owners had left a spare with her for emergencies, and she'd never mentioned it existed. The first real escalation came in September, about 4 months after we moved in. I got a certified letter, not an email, a certified letter, informing me that my decorative mailbox post, hand-carved, a gift from my son-in-law, was in violation of HOA Aesthetic Code Section 4.7, Paragraph B, and must be removed within 30 days or face a $50 per day fine. The mailbox post was beautiful. It was also completely inoffensive. Our neighbor, a man named Beaumont Crawford, retired Navy, 3 flags in his yard, barbecues every Sunday, told me over the fence that Dolores had sent him 7 violation letters in 2 years. "She doesn't like people who don't need her," Beaumont said, flipping a burger with the confidence of a man who has stopped caring what Dolores thinks. I filed a formal response to the letter, politely disputing the violation and citing Section 4.7 in full, which I had now actually read. She sent a second letter 2 weeks later, $60 fine. The game was on. I want you to understand something about Dolores Fitch before we go any further. She wasn't stupid. That's what made her dangerous. Petty tyrants who are stupid eventually trip over their own feet. Dolores was methodical. She had the HOA board, 3 members, all of whom she'd personally recruited, in her pocket. She had the management company, an outfit called Clarity HOA Solutions, taking their cues from her. And she had years of practice running people out of the neighborhood who didn't conform to her unwritten social order. I learned this from Beaumont, who had lived in Pinecroft Hollow for 11 years and served as my unofficial intelligence source, usually while handing me a bottle of something cold across the fence. She ran the Okafor family out in 2021, he said one evening, the summer crickets going absolutely wild in the tree line. Nice people, never violated a single rule. She just made their life miserable until they sold. That landed on me heavier than I showed. The mailbox post-war entered its second phase in October. I had removed nothing. Instead, I'd done something Dolores hadn't anticipated. I'd photographed every other mailbox on the street, cataloged every minor aesthetic deviation from the CC and Rs, and submitted a formal complaint to Clarity HOA Solutions about 11 of them. Not because I wanted anyone fined. I didn't. I wanted Dolores to have to answer for selective enforcement. Selective enforcement is actually a legal concept. If an HOA enforces rules against some residents and not others in a discriminatory or inconsistent pattern, it can void the enforceability of those rules and expose the association to liability. I found this out from a legal blog called HOA Warrior, which I will mention specifically because it was genuinely useful, and everyone watching this should bookmark it. Takeaway. Selective enforcement of HOA rules is a recognized legal defense. Document everything and file cross-complaints. Dolores's response to my 11 counter-complaints was instructive. Within 48 hours, she had personally visited each of the 11 neighbors, told them I had reported them, and framed me as a troublemaker who was trying to blow up the community. Classic move. Divide and isolate. It partially worked. 2 neighbors stopped waving. One, a guy named Prescott, who had a riding mower he loved more than his family, left a note on my truck saying I should mind my own business. But Beaumont laughed when I told him. She did the same thing to the Okafors, he said, turned people against them before they knew what was happening. He leaned on the fence post, squinting into the sunset like he was reading something in it. You know what the Okafors didn't have? What? Documentation and stubbornness. I had both. The real escalation came in November. I had begun working on our back deck, a legitimate construction project, permitted through Knox County, completely within our rights. I was out there one Saturday morning, the air carrying that particular cold-edge smell of late fall in Tennessee, leaves composting somewhere nearby, the diesel tang from a neighbor's generator drifting across the yard. I had a coffee. I had a plan. I was genuinely happy. At 9:14 a.m., I heard the front door open. I hadn't heard a knock. I hadn't received a 24-hour written notice. I walked through the house and found Dolores standing in my kitchen, clipboard in hand, examining a coffee maker like she was appraising it for an estate sale. I kept my voice level. Dolores, you didn't give notice. She didn't look up immediately. I texted you last night. The CC and Rs say written notice. A text doesn't qualify. She looked up then and gave me that smile. Garrett, let's not be difficult. I just need to verify the deck project dimensions for our records. You can do that from the permit filing with the county, which is public record. Please leave my home. She left, but she took her time about it. What I did next is the part that starts to matter. I called a locksmith that afternoon and had my locks rekeyed. Standard move, right? Except I also installed a secondary deadbolt, a Schlage B series, if you want to Google it, that operated on a separate key entirely. I told Lenora we were changing our security posture. Then I called our homeowner's insurance company and added a rider specifically documenting unauthorized entry concerns. Paper trail, people. Every phone call logged, every date noted. And I bought a small package of invisible UV marking dye from an online forensic supply company. I didn't know yet exactly how I'd use it, but I'd started thinking. December arrived, and Dolores arrived with it, like a particularly unwelcome Christmas decoration. The deck project was progressing beautifully. Tongue-and-groove cedar planking, a built-in bench along the railing, the whole thing county permitted and contractor inspected. My son-in-law, a big, quiet man named Thaddeus, had come down from Cincinnati to help over a long weekend, and we'd worked 2 solid days in the cold, hands smelling like cedar oil and sawdust, knuckles red, utterly content in the way that physical work makes you content. Then the HOA sent a stop work order, not from the county, from the HOA. Dolores had drafted a document on HOA letterhead, claiming that our deck project required HOA, Architectural Review Committee, approval before construction, and that proceeding without it was a violation, subject to fines of $150 per day. Here's the thing about that. The CC and Rs did require Architectural Committee approval for certain structural modifications. But there were 2 problems with Dolores's stop work order. First, the Architectural Review Committee was supposed to consist of 3 residents appointed by the board, and it currently had 0 members because Dolores had never appointed anyone. It was a ghost committee. Second, our deck dimensions and design fell under a CC and R exemption for deck replacement or repair on existing footprint, which is exactly what this was. We were rebuilding a deck that had existed since 1994. I did not respond emotionally. I responded in writing, via certified mail, citing both the non-existent committee and the exemption clause. I included photographs of the original deck's footprint, the county permit, and the relevant CC and R passages highlighted in yellow. I CC'd Clarity HOA Solutions, the Knox County Codes Office, and a man named Fitzgerald Dowd, who was the one other board member who I'd heard might not be entirely in Dolores's pocket. A retired school teacher, friendly eyes, lived 3 streets over. The stop work order was quietly withdrawn 4 days later. No apology, no acknowledgement. It simply ceased to exist, the way bad decisions do when they meet documentation. But Dolores escalated. She began appearing at my property with increasing frequency and decreasing notice. Twice in 1 week she walked through the side gate, which was unlocked at the time because we were hauling materials, and stood in our backyard, inspecting. I started keeping a log. Date, time, duration, what she said. Lenora started filming on her phone from the upstairs window whenever she heard the gate. This is when I discovered something important about the original key situation. I'd rekeyed the front door and added the secondary deadbolt so she couldn't enter the house proper anymore. But she'd apparently told at least one other board member that she had a right under the CC and Rs to access the property, the whole property, not just to knock, and that a homeowner changing their locks was obstructing HOA governance. She actually said that. Beaumont heard it at a board meeting. Obstructing HOA governance. I looked up Tennessee state law on HOA access rights that evening. Here's what I found. Tennessee Code Annotated, Section 66-27-405, governs planned community associations, and it requires that any right of entry provision in HOA documents comply with reasonable notice requirements and cannot supersede state trespass law. Meaning, even if your CC and Rs give the HOA access, that access cannot override your Fourth Amendment adjacent property rights. An unauthorized entry can constitute criminal trespass under TCA Section 39-14-405. Takeaway. State law governs HOA access rights, and in Tennessee, your CC and Rs cannot override state trespass statutes. Know your state's specific code. I filed a non-emergency report with the Knox County Sheriff's Office. Not a criminal complaint, not yet. A documented report. The deputy who took it was a laconic man who wrote everything down slowly and said, "You'd be surprised how many of these we get." It made me feel less insane. Meanwhile, the UV dye kit was sitting on my workbench in the garage. I'd been reading about how law enforcement and retail loss prevention use it. Invisible under normal light, glows vivid orange-yellow under UV illumination. And the formulation I'd bought was specifically designed to transfer from surfaces to skin and be extremely difficult to wash off without specialized soap. I'd been thinking about door frames, about the specific door frame on our back gate, which Dolores seemed particularly fond of using. But I needed her to keep coming. I needed her confident. So for now, I kept the gate unlocked. I kept the log. I let her feel like she was winning. There's a particular satisfaction in letting someone walk deeper into a hole they think is a welcome mat. January. The coldest stretch Knoxville had seen in 4 years. The deck was finished. It was genuinely beautiful, cedar going silver at the edges, catching the pale winter light like something from a magazine. Thaddeus had driven back to Cincinnati, impressed, which is hard to do with Thaddeus. Lenora had put up a string of outdoor lights along the railing, and we sat out there under blankets some evenings, which is an objectively unhinged thing to do in January, but felt like defiance, and defiance felt warm. Dolores sent a letter claiming the outdoor lights were a fire hazard under CC&R Section 7, Paragraph D, and must be removed. Section 7, Paragraph D regulated permanent exterior electrical fixtures. String lights plugged into an outlet are not permanent fixtures. I pointed this out. She escalated to the full board. The board meeting, my first time attending one, was held in the Pinecroft Hollow Clubhouse, a beige room that smelled of carpet cleaner and bureaucratic disappointment. 15 residents showed up, which I'd been told was unusually high. Dolores ran it like a sentencing hearing. She presented a slide about aesthetic standards and community values, and at one point used the phrase, "certain new residents," in a tone that was doing a lot of work. Fitzgerald Dowd, the retired school teacher, caught my eye from across the room. He gave the faintest nod. I filed it away. The board voted 3-1 to uphold the light violation notice. Fitz voted against. Dolores smiled her smile. I didn't argue in the room. I left, went home, and drafted a letter to the Tennessee Real Estate Commission, which oversees HOA management companies, filing a complaint against Clarity HOA Solutions for failing to ensure the HOA's enforcement actions complied with state law. I also sent a copy to Clarity's corporate parent, noting that selective enforcement complaints were now on record, and that I had documented at least 4 instances of unauthorized property entry. Within a week, Clarity had sent Dolores what I can only describe as a very stiff internal memo, asking her to document her authority for certain access visits. She was furious. I know this because Beaumont heard her on the phone in her driveway. Beaumont's lot is adjacent to hers, a geographic gift, and the word she used most frequently was undermined. Good. Here's where February gets interesting. I started noticing that our garage side door, a secondary entrance we rarely used, was showing signs of being tried. The handle had faint smudges, a scratch near the lock that was new. Nothing dramatic. But I'd been a field technician for 3 decades, and I notice when things aren't how I left them. I set up a small wildlife camera, a Bushnell, about $40, in the garage rafters aimed at that door. I told Lenora not to mention it to anyone. 3 days later, I had footage of Dolores Fitch trying the handle of our garage door at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. She had a key. It didn't work. That door used a different lock. She stood there for about 45 seconds, tried twice more, then walked away. I watched that video 4 times. Then I called my daughter's college roommate, a woman named Sable, who had become a civil litigation attorney in Nashville. We hadn't spoken in a while. I told her I had footage of my HOA president attempting unauthorized entry at 6:47 a.m. with a key. There was a pause on the line. Then Sable said, "Oh, she gave you everything." We talked for 90 minutes. Here's what I understood by the end of that call. What I had on video potentially constituted criminal trespass attempt under Tennessee law, civil trespass, breach of fiduciary duty by an HOA officer, and, if we could connect the selective enforcement pattern to any protected class, fair housing implications. Sable said she'd look at the full documentation. I sent her everything. The log, Lenora's phone footage, the camera footage, every certified letter, every response, every board meeting note. 14 months of careful, slightly obsessive documentation. Sable called back in 3 days. "Garrett," she said, "this is a case." Outside, the temperature had finally crept above freezing. The cedar on the deck smelled almost alive again in the pale February sun. Somewhere across the yard, a Carolina wren was going absolutely berserk in the oak tree, singing like it had something to prove. I knew the feeling. The trap was almost ready. Sable found something I hadn't known to look for. When she dug into the HOA's public filings, financial records, which are legally required to be available to any member of the association in Tennessee, she discovered something that changed the entire shape of this story. Pinecroft Hollow HOA had a reserve fund. All HOAs are supposed to maintain one. It's money set aside for major repairs, like repaving roads, replacing roofs on common areas, fixing the clubhouse. Industry standard is to fund the reserve to at least 70% of projected need. Pinecroft Hollow's reserve was at 11%. Where had the money gone? Over 3 years, the board had authorized a series of administrative expenses, always approved in meetings with minimal attendance, always proposed by Dolores, always vague. Community liaison services, governance consulting, aesthetic audit coordination. None of these line items had a vendor invoice attached in the public records. Sable submitted a formal records request under Tennessee Code Annotated Section 66-27-406, which requires HOAs to make financial records available to members. Clarity. HOA Solutions provided the records, slowly and with clear reluctance. The invoices, when they finally appeared, were issued by a sole proprietorship called Fitch Property Consulting, registered in 2020. Owner, Dolores Miriam Fitch. She had been paying herself from HOA funds, the homeowners' collective money, including mine, for 3 years. The total, as best Sable could calculate from the incomplete records, just over $22,000. Takeaway: HOA members have a legal right to financial records in most states. Request them, audit them, and look for vendor names that match board members. I sat with this for a full evening before I told Lenora. We were on the deck, under the lights that were still there, still beautiful, still technically a violation. Lenora is a quiet woman who does not startle easily. When I told her, she said nothing for about 30 seconds. Then she said, "She's been stealing from us, from the whole neighborhood, from Beaumont, from Fitzgerald, from all of them." "Yes." Lenora put down her tea. "Garrett, finish the trap." Here's what the trap accomplished that I hadn't fully appreciated until this moment. It was no longer just about proving that Dolores had entered our home without permission. It was about exposing someone who had been exploiting an entire community for years. The unauthorized entry was the hook. The die was the proof mechanism. But the financial fraud was the actual wound. I called Sable the next morning. She had already been thinking about how to present the financial evidence. She believed we had enough for a civil suit, and potentially enough to refer to the Knox County DA for criminal investigation. But she also said something that shaped everything. The most powerful moment will be public. If she's confronted privately, she'll deny, hire someone, delay. You need witnesses. You need it on record. The Pinecroft Hollow Spring Community Meeting was scheduled for late April. Mandatory attendance for all homeowners, per the CC and RS. One of the few provisions Dolores had actually enforced consistently, because the meeting was where she conducted board elections, and she needed bodies in the room to establish quorum. It was also, Sable noted, a meeting where financial reports were required to be presented. I started building toward April, and I started painting my gate. The UV dye trap wasn't complex. That was the point. The best traps aren't elaborate. They're inevitable. The compound I'd ordered was a professional-grade invisible UV marker, used by police departments to mark property for identification, and by retailers to tag merchandise. Under normal light, completely invisible. Under a UV blacklight flashlight, the cheap $10 kind you can buy on Amazon, it glows a vivid, almost violent orange-yellow. The formulation I had was designed to transfer from surfaces to skin on contact, and resist normal soap and water washing for days. To remove it fully required a specific citrus-based solvent, and you had to know what you were looking for. The application was simple. I mixed the dye with a clear furniture wax and painted it onto the metal surface of my back gate handle and latch, and along the lower 18 inches of the door frame on the garage side door, both places I had footage of Dolores touching. I let it cure for 24 hours. Then I tested it with the UV flashlight. My own fingerprints glowed like crime scene evidence. I left the gate unlocked. I moved the wildlife camera to a new angle, and I waited. Beaumont was my first ally, and the most important one. When I told him about the financial records, all of it, the fake consulting company, the $22,000, He sat down on his porch steps like someone had taken the wind out of him. "That woman," he said, very quietly. "That woman." He asked what I needed. I said I needed him to tell his neighbors, carefully, specifically, that there was going to be something worth attending at the April meeting. He did that with the precision of a man who spent 20 years as a Navy logistics officer. Within 2 weeks, I had 11 households committed to attending. He also connected me with a woman named Coralie Strand, who ran the Pinecroft Hollow Neighborhood Facebook group and had approximately 800 members. Coralie was 64 years old, recently retired from a career in HR, and had the organized ferocity of someone who has sat through too many meetings where nothing gets done. When I showed her the financial documents, she said, "I'm going to need copies of everything." Fitzgerald Dowd was next. I approached him carefully, not knowing how far his loyalty to the board ran. But Fitz was a principled man. I could tell that from the single vote he'd cast against me in January, and the way he'd met my eyes in that clubhouse. When I showed him the Fitch Property Consulting invoices, he read them twice, folded his hands, and said, "I have been on this board for 3 years. I have never been shown these invoices." His voice was level and extremely cold. He asked to speak with Sable directly. Sable, meanwhile, had taken 2 additional steps that I want to explain clearly because they're instructive. First, she filed a formal complaint with the Tennessee Secretary of State's HOA Registration Office and the Tennessee Real Estate Commission, documenting the financial irregularities and the access violations. This created an official investigation thread that would exist independently of anything that happened at the April meeting. Even if Dolores somehow managed to deflect the meeting confrontation, the state-level complaint was already moving. Second, she contacted a journalist at the Knoxville News-Sentinel who covered consumer and housing issues. She didn't give him the full story, just enough to make him interested. He agreed to attend the April meeting as a member of the public, which was his right, since HOA meetings in Tennessee are open to all homeowners and their guests. Takeaway: filing regulatory complaints before your public confrontation creates an independent evidentiary record that a target can't suppress by controlling the room. I spent March evenings at my workbench, the smell of machine oil, the particular cold silence of a garage at night, the satisfying weight of things being put in order. I prepared a binder, every document, dated and indexed, copies for Sable, Fitz, Coralie, and 2 spares. I rehearsed what I was going to say, which was not much. The documents would do the talking. My job was to keep my voice steady and let Dolores' own records convict her. Lenora ironed my good shirt for the meeting. "You look like a man who's about to do something," she said. "I am," I said. "Good," she said, and went back to her book. Outside, the April air smelled like thawing ground and the faint sweetness of Bradford pear trees doing their annual thing. Spring in Tennessee arrives with conviction. I like that about it. The gate handle gleamed, invisibly, in the dark. Dolores felt something shifting. People like her always do. They've survived by reading social weather, and the social weather in Pinecroft Hollow had changed. Neighbors who usually avoided eye contact with her were now stopping to talk to each other in driveways. Coralie had posted a vague but pointed message on the Facebook group encouraging full homeowner participation at the April meeting. 3 households had asked Clarity HOA Solutions for copies of the reserve fund statements. She moved to neutralize me directly. In late March, I received a formal notice. Again, certified mail. She did love certified mail. Informing me that my deck, now 2 months completed and county inspected, was in violation of a new HOA architectural review requirement that had been added to the CC&Rs at a special session of the board held on March 14th. I had not been notified of a special session. Neither had any other homeowner. Fitz had not been notified, and he was a board member. When I asked Clarity about it, they said they had received a notice of the session from Dolores and had posted it on the HOA website. I checked the website. The notice was dated March 13th, posted at 11:58 p.m. for a meeting held the following afternoon. 12 hours notice, 3 attendees, all Dolores' allies. The amendment they'd passed, essentially requiring retroactive architectural committee approval for all decks built after January 1st of that year, meaning mine, was, Sable informed me, almost certainly unenforceable. Tennessee law requires a minimum notice period for special sessions and a quorum of the full membership for amendments to governing documents, neither of which had occurred. The amendment was void, but it cost me time and attention, which was the point. Then Dolores tried something different. She went to Prescott, the riding mower man, and apparently told him that I was planning to sue the entire HOA, which would drive up everyone's dues and possibly put liens on all their homes. This was not true in any meaningful sense, but Prescott was the kind of man who processed information through his anxiety first and his judgment second. He started talking to other neighbors. I had to spend a week walking the street, door to door, explaining that the legal action being contemplated was against specific individuals, not the collective association. The door-to-door conversations, though, turned out to be useful. At house after house, I found people who had their own Dolores stories. A woman named Evangeline, who lived on the cul-de-sac, had been threatened with a fine for a garden that was, I am not exaggerating, too colorful. A young couple named the Brants, who had moved in the previous summer, had received 7 violation notices in 6 months, which is a rate that strongly suggested targeting. The Brants were the youngest couple on the street, and the only ones with a same-sex partnership, which I noted but said nothing about yet. Sable had asked me to document it. Beaumont quietly checked his own financial contribution to the HOA over 3 years, and calculated that his portion of Dolores's self-dealing totaled roughly $800. He was not a man who raised his voice, but when he said $800, his jaw had the tight look of someone doing considerable internal work to stay calm. Then, 2 weeks before the April meeting, the trap activated. Not the way I'd planned. I'd expected her to enter our property during the day. Instead, my wildlife camera caught her at 5:52 a.m. on an overcast Thursday. She came through the back gate. She still had a key to it, the original lock that I had deliberately not changed, and she touched the handle and the latch as she entered. She spent 11 minutes in our backyard, photographing the deck with her phone, then left. She touched the gate handle on the way out, too. I reviewed the footage that morning over coffee that tasted particularly good. Then I went out to the gate with my UV flashlight. The transfer was vivid. Whoever had touched that gate would be glowing orange on both hands for days. I texted Sable a photo of the illuminated handle. Her response 3 minutes later was, "Perfect. Don't warn her." I didn't. I sent the footage to Sable's secure file. I added it to the binder, and I continued my silent preparations for April, maintaining the patient, cheerful expression of a man with absolutely nothing going on. Dolores, I suspect, found my calmness irritating. Good. Irritation makes people sloppy. With 10 days to the April meeting, Dolores made her most aggressive move yet. She contacted 3 homeowners, I found out later, separately, through Beaumont and Coralie, and told them she had it on good authority that I was running some kind of scam, that I had filed fraudulent complaints with the state, and that I was, quote, trying to take control of the neighborhood for my own financial benefit. She said this with the certainty of someone who had decided that the best defense is a confusing offense. She also contacted Clarity HOA Solutions and asked them to postpone the April meeting, citing unresolved procedural questions. Clarity, perhaps feeling the warmth of the state regulatory complaint Sable had filed, declined. They sent Dolores a letter, a copy of which was forwarded to Fitz, who forwarded it to me, stating that the meeting would proceed as scheduled and that they strongly recommended all financial documentation be prepared and presented in full. The regulatory complaint was generating friction she couldn't control. She tried one more thing. She called me. I almost didn't pick up, but I did, and I let the call record. Tennessee is a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record a call I was a party to. The call was 12 minutes long and followed a recognizable pattern. First, a friendly opening. She called me Garrett 4 times in the first 2 minutes, which is 3 times too many when you've been sending someone certified violations for 14 months. Then a suggestion that reasonable people could resolve this quietly, that the financial records questions were probably just accounting confusion. Then, as I offered nothing but polite non-committal responses, a subtle shift to veiled threat. She mentioned that she had concerns about unpermitted modifications to my property, and that she'd hate for that to complicate things. I said, "Dolores, I look forward to seeing you at the meeting. I think it's going to be very informative." She paused a long beat. "It doesn't have to go the way you're planning." "I'm just planning to attend," I said, "like every other homeowner." I sent the recording to Sable within the hour. Sable listened to it and said the phrase, "complication modification concerns," combined with the timing, could be characterized as witness intimidation, which was a gift I hadn't asked for but would accept. Meanwhile, I was quietly reinforcing the community network Beaumont had started building. Coralie had organized a private group chat with 23 households. The Brants had connected with a fair housing advocacy organization in Knoxville, who expressed interest in the pattern of violations against newer and younger residents. Fitz had reviewed 3 years of board minutes and identified 9 instances where Dolores had called votes without proper quorum or notice. The meeting was going to be attended by approximately 40 homeowners in a clubhouse that held 50. The journalist from the News Sentinel had confirmed. And Sable, who could not attend as legal counsel without triggering a more formal posture, had prepared a clear, one-page summary of the financial findings that I could present as a homeowner exercising my rights under Tennessee law. What I want to convey in this stretch of days is not frantic activity. It was the opposite. I spent evenings on the deck. Lenora and I watched the spring come in, the dogwoods going white, the sound of the neighborhood settling into warmth, the particular smell of fresh mulch that signals April in a subdivision. I grilled burgers with Beaumont on a Sunday, and he told stories about his Navy years, and his dog, a basset hound named Commissioner, snored magnificently under the picnic table. These are the things you're fighting for when you fight back against a Dolores. Not the abstract principle of property rights, though that matters. The actual texture of a place where you feel at home. The night before the meeting, I ironed my own shirt this time. Lenora was already asleep. I checked the binder one more time. Documents in order, timestamps matched. The wildlife camera footage copied to a thumb drive. I went out to the back gate and shone the UV light on the handle one final time. Still glowing. Somewhere in this neighborhood, Dolores Fitch had orange hands she hadn't figured out yet. The spring air smelled like cedar and possibility, and the Carolina wren was at it again in the dark, absurdly loud, absurdly cheerful, as if it was fully aware of what was about to happen and deeply in favor of it. The Pinecroft Hollow Spring Community Meeting began at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday in late April. By 6:45, the clubhouse was full. 41 homeowners in a room designed for 50, folding chairs brought in from storage, the smell of carpet cleaner losing its battle against that many people and that much anticipation. Coralie had made coffee. Beaumont sat in the front row with Commissioner, the basset hound, who was technically not allowed in the clubhouse, but whose presence Dolores apparently calculated was not worth the confrontation. Commissioner settled under the chair and sighed the sigh of a dog who has seen things. Dolores arrived in her blazer, pearls, and the expression of someone who believes they have already won. She took her position at the head table beside the 2 compliant board members. Fitz sat at the far end of the table, with the studied neutrality of a man who knows something is coming. The journalist was in the 3rd row with a notepad, and the low-key alertness of someone who has been to many meetings, but suspects this one will be different. The meeting opened with routine items. Dolores moved through them briskly, clearly trying to limit time. But under Tennessee Code Annotated Section 66-27-406, any member of the association has the right to raise financial matters before the board during the homeowner comment period. The comment period could not be skipped. I waited for it. When Dolores opened the floor for comments, I stood up, stated my name and address for the record, and said, "I'd like to request that the board present the current reserve fund balance and a breakdown of administrative expenditures for the past 3 fiscal years." There it was, in public, on record, with 41 people in the room. Dolores smiled. "Those documents are available upon written request, Garrett. This isn't really the forum." "Tennessee law," I said, "requires financial reports be presented at annual member meetings. This is that meeting. I'm making the request now, on the record." Fitz spoke from the end of the table, his school teacher's voice carrying perfectly. "I'd like to second that request. As a board member, I'll note I haven't been provided these figures for the current fiscal year." The room shifted. When a board member says he hasn't seen the financial reports, that's not a procedural dispute, that's an event. Dolores said that the figures weren't finalized. I handed a copy of the one-page summary, sourced entirely from the HOA's own records that Clarity had been compelled to provide, to the person next to me and asked them to pass it down the row. I had 40 copies. I had prepared for this room. The copies spread through the rows with the quiet efficiency of information that has been waiting too long to travel. I watched Dolores's face as people read. I watched the moment she understood that the room knew. Then I said, I'd also like to present documented evidence of unauthorized entry to my property on 7 separate occasions, including footage from March of this year. I held up the thumb drive. I'll be providing this to the Knox County Sheriff's Office, which I've already been in contact with, and to the Tennessee Real Estate Commission, where a complaint is currently under review. Someone in the back said, 7 times? The 2 compliant board members were looking at each other with the expressions of people who are rapidly recalculating their personal exposure. Now the die. Finally, I said, I'd like to note for the room that my back gate was accessed without authorization on April 10th, at 5:52 a.m., by someone using a key. I treated that entry point with an invisible UV transfer compound as a forensic measure. I turned on the UV flashlight, the cheap $10 kind. I held it up toward the head table. I wasn't aiming it at anyone. I didn't need to. I just let the light exist in the room. Dolores looked at her hands. Under the UV light, the orange glow was unmistakable. Both hands. The gate handle, the latch, 14 days of transfer that had not fully faded. The room saw it. The journalist wrote something down. Commissioner the Basset Hound chose this precise moment to emit a long, exhausted groan from under Beaumont's chair. Dolores stood up. This is harassment. Dolores. It was Fitz, still in his schoolteacher voice, the kind that has silenced rooms full of teenagers and works just as well on adults. Sit down. She didn't sit down. She walked out. The Knox County Sheriff's deputy who had been outside, Sable had called ahead and made sure someone was available, was, in fact, there when she reached the parking lot. What happened after that night took months to fully resolve, the way real justice usually does, not in a single flash but in a series of quiet, satisfying dominoes. Dolores Fitch resigned from the HOA board the following morning, before she was formally removed. The Knox County DA's office opened a preliminary investigation into the financial irregularities, specifically the $22,000 paid to Fitch Property Consulting. As of the time of this telling, that investigation is ongoing, which means, I will say, she is presumed innocent of any criminal wrongdoing, but will let you draw your own conclusions about a woman who paid herself from community funds for 3 years under the cover of a company no one knew she owned. Clarity HOA Solutions terminated their contract with Pinecroft Hollow and issued a written statement noting that they had flagged the financial irregularities to the board in 2022 and received no response. The board members who had received that flagging, Dolores's 2 allies, quietly did not seek re-election. The trespass documentation, the camera footage, the UV dye evidence, the phone recording, was preserved as part of the civil suit Sable filed on our behalf. That suit settled. I've been asked not to disclose the specific terms, but I can tell you that our legal fees were covered, and that a certain amount of personal satisfaction is difficult to put a dollar figure on. Fitzgerald Dowd was elected HOA president at the emergency special meeting held in May, by a vote of 38-1. I don't know who cast the dissenting vote, and I have decided I don't need to know. Fitz's first act as president was to commission a full reserve fund audit. His second was to abolish the new resident inspection program, which he confirmed had no basis in the original CC&Rs. His third was to repeal every violation notice that had been issued against the Brants. The practical things I want you to take from this story, and I mean actually take, write them down if you have a HOA, are these. Get your CC&Rs and read them, the full document, today. Request your HOA's financial records annually. Know your state's HOA statute. If someone is entering your property without proper notice, document every instance and file a report. And understand that invisible UV marker dye is legal, available, and has been used by law enforcement for decades. There's nothing exotic about it. The Brants threw a block party in June, on a Sunday, in the cul-de-sac. Beaumont grilled, Commissioner wore a bandana and ate an implausible amount of hot dog that no one admitted to giving him. Evangeline brought her absurdly colorful garden produce in a basket. Coralie organized a cornhole tournament that got surprisingly competitive. At some point in the evening, Fitz stood up with a beer and said, without drama, "I want to announce that the Pinecroft Hollow HOA is going to redirect the administrative savings from our new governance model toward a community scholarship fund for neighborhood kids' college applications." He looked around the cul-de-sac. Dolores spent $22,000 on herself. We're going to spend the recovered funds on everyone else's children. That got a round of applause that I felt in my chest. Lenora squeezed my hand. That's the ending I want to leave you with. Not the orange dye, though I won't pretend I don't enjoy that image. Not even the legal reckoning, satisfying as it was. The ending is a scholarship fund and a cornhole tournament and a basset hound eating contraband hot dogs, while 40 neighbors remember that a community is something you build together, not something one person controls from the top with a clipboard and a grudge.
You know what stayed with me most from this whole thing? That the meeting of the Jury guy, leaving Dorothy's walking out of that clubhouse, straight into the deputies that Bo had made sure was waiting outside. It was Grelona. Sitting on that deck, the deck Dorothy's tried 3 times to shut down, stringing lights on, tea in hand, finally quiet, like we got in our house back. Kara didn't win because he got lucky, he won because he documented everything, learned the rules better than the person recognizing them, and stay patient when every instinct said react. $22,000 stolen from the neighborhood, 14 months of unauthorized entries, one camera catching her at 5:52 a.m., one $10 UV flashlight that lit up everything she thought she gotten away with. That's the math on how you beat someone who thinks the system belongs to her. If you've ever gotten a violation notice that felt personal, you already know what that 7 a.m. click felt like. Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. If you hit close to home, share for the neighbor on your street who's been getting letters for months and thinks they're alone. Subscribe to HOA Stories. We see you next week. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone abuse the rules is learn them better than they do.